Welcome back to our Sunday School series on Covenant Theology. This is lesson number 6, the Mosaic Covenant. Today we continue back through our series on Covenant Theology. We're in a new administration today, the Mosaic Covenant, the Mosaic administration of the Covenant of Grace. Same outline that we've been using. We're going to do a little bit of review. We'll look at our definition of bond and blood sovereignly administered. We'll take a look at the elements of a covenant as it relates to the Mosaic administration, and then answer the question, what's revealed about the covenant of grace in this administration? Okay, let's take a look at our chart here as our first review piece. The most important thing that we want to remember as we look at this chart is that we're under one covenant of grace, and that these various administrations are still part of the same covenant of grace. So we've been through Adam, Noah, and we spent 2 weeks on Abraham. So we've progressed now into the Mosaic administration here. And you'll remember that we made this distinction between universal and national covenants, where Adam and Noah were universal covenants, whereas they dealt with the whole of humanity. These covenants here, Abraham, Moses, and David, is where we begin to narrow the focus a little bit, where the seed that was promised here to Adam, now we know is going to come through this man, Abraham, and his family. And now this family, as we move to Moses, this family has grown into a people, a nation, which is a fulfillment of the promise that was made to Abraham, right? So we see this progression taking place. Now we're in individual families, but now this is going to broaden out into a people group, a nation. So this is a national covenant here with Moses. As we move into David, that will also be a national covenant. And then we'll move into the new covenant realities after we take a look at David. Now today we could spend, there's a lot of material in Scripture on the Mosaic covenant, right? From Exodus to Leviticus, to Numbers, to Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. That's going to take us all through the Mosaic covenant until we reach David. But we're not going to read all 7 or 8 of those books this morning as we go through it. We're going to focus on primarily the making of the covenant with Moses. We're going to look at Exodus chapter 3, and we're going to look at Exodus 19 and 20. So we're going to focus on those 3 chapters and hone in and answer the questions that we've been asking. So you can go ahead and turn to Exodus chapter 3. And while you're doing that, you can just listen, because I'm just going to catch you up with biblical history as we've progressed from the covenant with Abraham. And you'll remember that after we have the covenant with Abraham, the rest of Genesis progresses through Abraham's life, then Isaac. After we get through Isaac's life, which is relatively brief compared to the others, Abraham, Isaac, then we'll go through the story with Jacob and Esau, then Jacob having the 12 sons. Joseph is the next character where we spend a majority of time in Genesis. Joseph's life, where he's sold into slavery, rises to power, and then delivers Israel from the famine throughout Egypt and Canaan. Genesis ends with Joseph, and Exodus picks up with Moses. So we've gone Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and then Exodus opens up with the life of Moses. So as far as biblical history is concerned, all of that has elapsed until we pick up here in Exodus chapter 3 with the covenant with Moses. Now, I want to make just 2 introductory remarks before we kind of consider our definition of bond and blood sovereignly administered. Number 1 is this covenant with Moses. We've seen that the covenants have kind of gotten nicknames throughout theology. We had, for example, the covenant with Abraham was known as the covenant of promise. And we saw how chock full that covenant was of promise. This administration of the covenant of grace is commonly called the covenant of law. And there's a lot of confusion sometimes about law, but I'm going to just cut through all the confusion and try to make it clear. Number 1, always, law is subservient to the covenant of grace. Right? Makes sense when we look at the graphic, right? Covenant of grace is being unfolded throughout redemptive history, and these are various administrations that are unfolding this one covenant of grace. So obviously, just as these three covenants were subservient to the overall unfolding of the covenant of grace, so is the administration with Moses. So law is always subservient to grace, okay? Secondly, the covenant with Moses is not a separate covenant. It's not some covenant off by itself that's distinct from the covenant of grace and the other administrations that we have seen. It's organically related to and in union with and continuity with all the other administrations we've seen, and will be in union and continuity with the ones that will follow. So the covenant with Moses is not some parentheses or some extra covenant away from what we've already been looking at. It's perfectly in union and with continuity, in continuity with the other administrations that we've seen. That's the second thing I want to make clear. And the third thing I want to make clear is that this is not another covenant of works. Okay? When we talked about the covenant of works early on in the series, we talked about the covenant of works being that covenant that God made with Adam, that upon his perfect obedience he would receive life, and upon his disobedience he would receive death. A covenant of works. God was pleased to enter into a second covenant of grace with Adam and his posterity. And with the Mosaic covenant, some want to say that this is a reiteration of the covenant of works, that now there's some basis upon which obedience determines salvation. That's not true. This is not a reinstitution of the covenant of works. It's not a reiteration. Is it related? Of course. All of these covenants are related to each other, but it is not another second covenant of works. Okay, so the three things, just to reiterate what's going on here. Law is always subservient to grace. It's not over the covenant of grace. It's not apart from the covenant of grace. The Mosaic covenant is not some separate covenant other than what we've already seen on our illustration on the back of the board here. It's in union and continuity with all of the other administrations, and it's not another covenant of works. All right, I set that up for you at the beginning. That just answers all the confusion at the start. Okay? Any questions about these three ideas? It should be kind of straightforward, I think, based on where we've been so far, that these things would be true. Okay, now let's take a look at our definition here. We're working with this definition by O. Palmer Robertson, that a covenant is a bond in blood that is sovereignly administered. Now, as we come to Exodus chapter 3, we'll begin to see this unfold. So let's start with Exodus chapter 2, verse 24. We'll read through chapter 3 and start to unpack some of these terms in the definition. Now, God heard their groaning, that is the Israelites, under the oppression of the Egyptians. And God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel and God knew. Okay? When it says that God remembered his covenant with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, it wasn't like I do when I'm trying to bake cookies and I'm playing with the boys and then all of a sudden I remember I've got cookies in the oven because I smell the smoke, right, coming out of the oven. And I just remembered, oh, I've got cookies in the oven. God didn't say, oh, yeah, I've got this covenant that I set up with Abraham, and I just remembered it because I smelled the smoke of the Israelites suffering. When he talks about remembering his covenant, it means that he is being faithful to the covenant that he has made with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. That's what it means that he remembered, that he is going to be faithful to what he has said he will do in this covenant. And that's grace, right? God entered into these covenants graciously. And that should remember to keep grace over and above law. Now let's look at chapter 3. These passages are very familiar to you, but I hope that in the context of looking at them with covenant, they'll make a little bit more sense. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Now that's Mount Sinai. And the angel of Yahweh appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When Yahweh saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. Then he said, Do not come near. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then Yahweh said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And now, behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, But I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Then Moses said to God, If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, Say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say this to the people of Israel, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt, and I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. And they will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, and now please let us go a 3 days' journey into the wilderness that we may sacrifice to Yahweh our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. After that he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty, but each woman shall ask of her neighbor and any woman who lives in her house for silver and gold jewelry and for clothing. You shall put them on your sons and on your daughters, and so shall you plunder the Egyptians. Now that's a very familiar passage to you because it's a very important passage in all of Scripture. But let's look at it first with this first term of our definition as far as a bond is concerned, because there are 5 primary ways in which we see God enter into a bond or re-emphasize his bond with this people. Number 1, in verse 6, what does he call himself? I am the God of your father, and the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Okay? So, number 1, he's re-emphasizing the relationship that he has already had with their forefathers, their family. They are the descendants of those with whom he has a relationship. So I am identifying myself as this God with whom I have made a covenant with your forefathers, and by extension you as well. That's in verse 6. In verse 7, he identifies them as my people. Right? Why are they his people? Well, he made a promise to Abraham, right? That he would be the father of a multitude. And here's that multitude. And so he identifies them as his people. Number 3, here's the bond that he makes with Moses. Moses asks the question, how am I going to do this? And God says, I will be with you. That's his bond, an inviolable bond. God has promised to be with him. Okay? Number 4, in verse 14, God gives Moses his covenant name. Who shall I tell him sent me? And he says, tell him Yahweh sent you. Now Yahweh, this is in the Hebrew, this sound, Yahweh, sounds like I am. That's why in the English it's said, I am who I am. Tell him I am has sent you. So he gives him this covenant name, right? This name is always used in association with the covenant God has made with his people. Number 5, in verse 18, God identifies himself as the God of the Hebrews. Okay? So there should be no question. God has entered into a bond with Moses specifically and with the people, the descendants of Abraham here physically. All right, so we see bond in chapter 3, very clear. Now, when we talk about a bond in blood, you'll remember that this means the covenant has life and death consequences. Okay? That's what we mean by a bond in blood. Now, we didn't read this in chapter 3, but I'm going to highlight a few things before we get to 19 and 20. In chapter 4, there's an interesting little inset of the Lord's going to kill Moses because he hasn't circumcised his son. The Lord appears to Moses as he and his wife and family are moving back to Egypt to do what God has commanded to do, but he has not circumcised his son, which you'll remember was the sign of the covenant with Abraham, and God appears to kill him because he has not obeyed the covenant. Now his wife circumcises their son, Gershom, and throws the foreskin at Moses' feet and said, you're a bridegroom of blood to me, and the Lord does not then kill Moses because the circumcision has taken place. That just reemphasizes that the covenant with Abraham was one of life and death consequences. Because Moses has violated the covenant, and the Lord breaks out to kill him because he's violated the covenant. But in his mercy, because the circumcision takes place at that time, he does not follow through with the death of Moses. The second thing, that's in chapter 4. So that's chapter 4. And that's really a re-emphasis of the life and death consequences of the Abrahamic covenant. Now what happens between 4 and 19 are the 10 plagues, right? Moses goes back to Egypt, tells Pharaoh to let his people go, says no, and they go back and forth for these 10 plagues. Now the plagues culminate in the 10th plague. And what's the 10th plague? The 10th plague is the death of the firstborn, right? Man and animal. And the way for the angel of death, for the Lord to pass over your family and your property, is to shed the blood of a lamb and put the blood over your doorposts. And when God sees that, he will pass over your house and will not take the firstborn. That's chapter 19. That's chapter 12. Where we have the Passover, or the 10th plague, where we see this life and death consequences for not obeying the command of the Lord to shed the blood of a lamb and put it over your doorpost. That still doesn't get us to this covenant specifically. We'll see this in chapter 19. So we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but we need to, as we look at this definition. Flip over to chapter 19 and look at verse 12. We'll start there for a second. So at 19, the Israelites have made the mass exodus. They're out of Egypt. They've crossed the Red Sea. They're out into the wilderness, and they're coming to Mount Sinai. Okay, in chapter 19, God meets with Moses to prepare to officially enter into the covenant with Moses. Okay? And he gives these stipulations. Remember, we're looking at the life and death consequences here. And he gives these stipulations. Look at verse 12 and 13. You shall set limits for the people all around, that is, all around the mountain of Sinai, saying, take care not to go up into the mountain or touch the edge of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall be stoned or shot. whether beast or man, he shall not live. Okay? So here's the first part of the life and death consequences. God is giving some instructions before he officially enters into this covenant. Draw a line basically around the mountain and tell the people, do not come across the line and touch the mountain, or they will die. Because of the seriousness of the covenant and the relationship he's about to enter into, and because he is a holy God and these are sinful people, he sets boundaries that shall not be crossed. And the penalty for crossing those boundaries is death. Now we see a reiteration of this a few verses later. If you look at verse 21 and 22, Yahweh said to Moses, "Go down and warn the people lest they break through to Yahweh to look and many of them perish. Also let the priests who come near to Yahweh consecrate themselves lest Yahweh break out against them." That is, break out against them in death to kill them, because they have broken through unconsecrated. They have not done what is required in order to enter into the presence of the Lord. So does this bond have life and death consequences? You bet it does. And we see it leading up to the actual institution of the covenant in chapter 19 and 20. So we see these reiterations of life and death consequences with the covenant here. Any questions about this idea? This will continue. I'm just highlighting some of the things as we go through. As you move through chapter 20 and then on through the rest of the Pentateuch, this life and death consequences are reiterated over and over. Now the last part of the definition is a bond in blood sovereignly administered. And just like with the other covenants, you always see that it's God who initiates the covenant. He sovereignly initiates the covenant with the individual and then obviously through their descendants. God is the one who initiates. Number two, there's no bargaining that takes place. And number three, it's always God who is giving the commands. Now, interestingly, God gives Moses a command to go to Pharaoh to let his people go. There's no bargaining about that, right? Moses is going to do that. But God condescends to Moses graciously by letting Moses bring Aaron with him and let Aaron do a lot of the work as far as speaking is concerned and that sort of thing. It looks like bargaining that's happening there, but as far as the actual command that you're going to Pharaoh to lead my people out of Egypt, there's no bargaining there. That's a sovereign administration of the covenant, a stipulation that we'll see here. So as we look throughout the story here, it's always God initiating, it's always God commanding, it's always God in control. Moses doesn't have any control over administering the covenant, the Mosaic covenant. Okay, one other note about this, this is a side note here. What we see happen when God appears to enter in the covenant is what we've seen happen with all the previous covenants. That is how he appears in a theophany to the people. How does he appear on Sinai? Smoke, fire, cloud, storm. That's God's preferred theophany when he appears to make a covenant, because he does it with Adam and Eve in the garden. He comes in the wind of the day to Adam and Eve to ask them the question, "What have you done?" They run and hide because they hear God coming. They don't hear him whistling, walking through the garden in the cool of the day. They hear him coming in a storm, and they run and hide because they know they have sinned against him. With Noah, God comes in judgment on the earth. Storm, flood, cloud. And we see in the sign that he sets the sign that I'm not going to do this again in front of the storm cloud, so that there is both this grace and this idea of judgment, of holiness against sin that takes place. With Abraham, the same thing happens. When he enters into the covenant with the official ratifying ceremony, how does he appear and pass through the parts of the animals? As a flaming pot and smoking pot in a flaming oven. Fire and smoke, again, he appears. And so we see that happen again on Sinai as he appears sovereignly to demonstrate his power and his holiness before a sinful people. He is sovereign, he is powerful, he is holy, and the people are sinful. And they understand that immediately as he appears in this way to them at Sinai. So we clearly see that the Mosaic Covenant helps us understand this definition as well. It's a bond in blood that is sovereignly administered. What we'll look at now is we'll move to chapter 19, but we'll piggyback off of some of the things we read in chapter 3 as now we lay out the elements of the covenant, which is what we've done previously. And you've got on your handout all the elements broken down. I'll write them up here. We'll add to them as we go through. Look again at chapter 19, and we'll start to flesh this covenant out a little bit. Before we read, let's go ahead and put these up here. These are easy. Parties are God and Moses. And as we've seen before, this extends out to descendants of, namely Abraham. But it's not just with Moses, it's with all the people of Israel, right? Well, he's already made a preamble twice in chapter 3, so let me see if you can remember. A preamble is where the sovereign declares names and titles and how he has dealt benevolently with the one into whom he enters a covenant. And so we saw him do this with Abraham, I am God Almighty, and we've seen him do it already in chapter 3. So there's at least twice where he has preambled or declared himself by names and titles. In chapter 3, what were one or two that you remember? Yeah, the God of your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. All right, that's one in chapter 3. And the second one is, I am who I am. Yeah, that's right. The covenant name. So he's declaring who he is to Moses. That's a preamble to the covenant. In chapter 3, he does it. He's going to do it again in chapter 20 as he begins to lay out the Ten Commandments. So let's just look at chapter 20 real quick. Flip over to verses 1 and 2 so we can finish out this preamble part. God has now set the boundaries, set the stipulations to enter into this covenant in chapter 20. And this is how he starts off. God spoke all these words saying, I am Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Declares himself by a name, declares himself as the one who has acted benevolently with those into whom he enters covenant here, right? I am the God who brought you out of Egypt and out of slavery. 20 verse 2. So there we have the preamble. Parties, preamble. Now stipulations, we've already seen some stipulations specifically with Moses in chapter 3. There's a lot of stipulations in this covenant. It's the covenant of law. So we're going to have a lot of stipulations. But as we start here in chapter 3, what were some of the stipulations, the things that he required of Moses in chapter 3?
Go to Pharaoh.
Okay, that's the primary one, right? Go to Pharaoh, and for what purpose? To let my people go, right? He's going to free the people. That's the primary stipulation that we see in chapter 3. You're the man, you're going to Pharaoh, and you're going to tell him to set my people free and to let them go. That's the primary stipulation that he gives in chapter 3. Now, when we get to chapter 19, here's what I want to do. Let's read through the big chunk from 19 through the 10 Commandments, because it'll be nice to see that in one clear block of the story. And then all these promises and signs and everything, they'll start to just fall out, and then you'll see it as we go through it. So let's start back at 19 verse 1, and then we'll go through and explain a few things. On the third new moon, after the people of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on that day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. Okay, that's Mount Horeb, where God met with Moses earlier in chapter 3. Out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain, Mount Sinai, while Moses went up to God. Yahweh called to him out of the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the people of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. What's he doing? Preamble. All right? Remember how I have dealt with you benevolently. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, what covenant is he referring to? The ones that he has already made and the one he's about to make, which all are part of the overarching covenant of grace. You shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel. So Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all these words that Yahweh had commanded him. All the people answered together and said, all that Yahweh has spoken we will do. And Moses reported the words of the people to Yahweh. And Yahweh said to Moses, behold, I am coming to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you, and may also believe you forever. When Moses told the words of the people to Yahweh, Yahweh said to Moses, go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their garments, and be ready for the third day. For on the third day Yahweh will come down on Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people, and you shall set limits for the people all around, saying, take care not to go up into the mountain or touch the edge of it. Whoever touches the mountain shall be put to death. No hand shall touch him, but he shall be stoned or shot, that is with an arrow, whether beast or man, he shall not live. When the trumpet sounds a long blast, they shall come up to the mountain. So Moses went down from the mountain to the people and consecrated the people, and they washed their garments. And he said to the people, be ready for the third day. Do not go near a woman. That is to have sexual relations. On the morning of the third day, there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. Then Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they took their stand at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because Yahweh had descended on it in fire. The smoke of it went up like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled greatly. And as the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and God answered him in thunder. Yahweh came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain, and Yahweh called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. And Yahweh said to Moses, go down and warn the people, lest they break through to Yahweh to look, and many of them perish. Also let the priests who come near to Yahweh consecrate themselves, lest Yahweh break out against them. And Moses said to Yahweh, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you yourself warned us, saying, set limits around the mountain and consecrate it. And Yahweh said to him, go down and come up, bringing Aaron with you. But do not let the priests and the people break through to come up to Yahweh, lest he break out against them. So Moses went down to the people and told them. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of Yahweh your God in vain, for Yahweh will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to Yahweh your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that Yahweh your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Now when all the people saw the thunder, and the flashes of lightning, and the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood far off, and said to Moses, you speak to us, and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us, lest we die. Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. The people stood far off, while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. Okay, that's a powerful story as we see God enter into a covenant with Moses and the people of Israel. So let's unpack a few of the things that are going on here. Number one, the stipulations that we see laid out specifically in chapter 20 are the 10 Commandments. Okay? You see the 10 Commandments laid out. These are the primary stipulations, the summary of God's will, of God's law. They're laid out here. Now, what will happen in the ensuing chapters and books is an elaboration of these 10 commands. All right, here's the summary of God's will, and this is going to be elaborated on in 3 different ways: in civil, ceremonial, and moral law. Okay? Civil, ceremonial, and moral law. This sounds familiar to you, I'm sure. So we've got the 10 Commandments, which are the stipulations of the covenant. These 10 Commandments are moral in nature. That is, they apply universally to all men through all time. They don't ever go away. All right? They're moral in nature. Now, as we see the rest of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy unfold, we see all these various laws. Some of them are archaic and they're confusing to us, right? Don't weave these kind of things together. You're like, okay, I guess we won't do that. We don't understand because we're not part of this civil and ceremonial construct which Israel was at that time, right? Now, the reason these distinctions are important is because you will face people who say, oh, you just pick and choose what parts of the Bible you want to obey. You don't stone people because they dishonor their mother and father, and it says to do that in the Bible. Well, how do you answer that question? What? Well, the Bible says to treat your slaves a certain way. Now, well, you're okay with slavery? And you got to come up with an answer to that. And the answer to all those kind of questions is to understand the law is broken down in this way. That there are civil laws those are laws that are for the nation of Israel to function as an entity, as a nation at that time in that part of history. Now, what happens to the nation of Israel? It's sent into exile, right? And it's disbanded and it's done away with. So the civil law is done. There are principles within the civil law that we can use to guide us. So you've heard me use this example before, but there's a civil law that says you're supposed to put a parapet or a fence around your roof. Well, why don't you have a fence around your roof? It says to do that in the law. Well, the purpose of that is an elaboration of the 6th command. You shall not murder. If somebody comes over to your house and you're spending time on the roof, because that's where it was cool to spend time and relax and spend leisure time on the roof, and they fall off your roof because there's no protection around the roof, you're liable for that life. So there's a civil law that says put a fence around your roof. Well, guess what? In Florida, it's hot here. And we all have a lot of pools around. And what's a law in Florida about a pool? You better have a fence around that pool to protect the life of those children, for example, who might fall into the pool. That's a principle that comes from the civil law, right? So while the specific law is not applicable because that's part of the law specific to the nation of Israel at that time, there are principles that we can pull out of the civil law to help guide us in our current day. Now, the ceremonial law, we just spent a long time in Hebrews. We understand why the ceremonial law doesn't apply. Because the reality of Christ has come to fulfill those shadows. So when the reality of Christ is here, we don't need the shadows anymore. Those are shadows that pointed forward to something greater in a reality, and the reality has come. Civil law is gone, ceremonial law is gone. What's left is the moral law. Moral law that is binding to all men for all time, summarized in the 10 Commandments. Okay? So as we talk about the stipulations of the Mosaic Covenant, here we have the revelation of God's will for man in the 10 Commandments. Questions about the stipulations? There's a lot more of them if you want to keep reading, right? A whole lot of commands that follow after Exodus chapter 20. Now let's talk about promises and curses, blessings for a second. Note that in chapter 3, God lays out several promises to Moses right from the beginning. And these, I'll just list them for you. In verse 8, this is chapter 3, verse 8, he reemphasizes the promise. Listen to this. I have come down to deliver the Israelites out of the hand of the Egyptians. That's the first promise specific to that covenant, right? I've come to deliver the Israelites. And to bring them out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey. That's a restatement of the promise that he gave to Abraham. This land that you're passing through, I'm going to give this land to you and your descendants, right? So God's being faithful. He's remembering his covenant with Abraham to bring his descendants into the promised land. In verse 17, there's, let's do it this way. Verse 17 is just a restatement of the same promise in chapter 3, where he says, I promise that I will bring you out of the affliction of Egypt to a land flowing with milk and honey. And then in verses 21 and 22, there's a specific promise that he gives to Moses and the Israelites where he says, I will give this people, that is the Israelites, favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and you will plunder the Egyptians. Right? You're going to ask them for gold and silver and clothing, and they're going to give it to you. And you're going to plunder them in this way. So that's a promise that he gives to Moses and to the Israelites. Now, as we see the Ten Commandments pop up, there are promises associated just with the Ten Commandments. So we see in verse 6, he says that I will show my love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. That's a promise associated with that specific commandment, right? I will show my love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. Now, on the flip side of that, there's a curse also associated with this command. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. He says, I am Yahweh, your God, a jealous God. I'll visit the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. So we've seen this before as God has talked with the other patriarchs. Those who hate you, I will curse. Those who bless you, I will bless. Same thing here. Those who hate me, I will curse. And those who love me, I will bless. But notice the stark distinction between the curse and the bless. The curse is 3 to 4 generations. The blessing is 1,000 generations. Okay? That emphasizes God's mercy and grace. That he is merciful 1,000 times what he does to bring judgment. His grace and mercy are infinitely greater than we can imagine. And so we see that promise there. Now the next place we want to go, and let's flip there for a second, Deuteronomy 28. Because this entire chapter is covenant curses and covenant blessings. And Deuteronomy is the second telling of the law. And so we have a second telling of the Ten Commandments. We have tellings of the various stipulations, civil, ceremonial, and moral, that are happening in Deuteronomy. And in Deuteronomy chapter 28, we won't read through it. I just want to let you see this. That here at the end of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, we have God re-emphasizing his blessing and cursing. You notice your Bible may have a subheading that says something like blessings for obedience or covenant blessings or covenant promises. But in 28, starting at verse 1, going all the way to verse 14, is all blessings for obedience to the covenant. Now, from verse 15 all the way to the end of chapter 15, which is like 60 verses, is curses for disobeying the covenant. All right? Now, if you take the time to read through it, and I encourage you to read through this chapter, it's like a preview of what's to come for the nation of Israel. Because what happens? They disobey the covenant. And everything that God says in Deuteronomy chapter 28 happens as far as curses are concerned. So Deuteronomy 28 lays out the promises and curses for obedience and disobedience. You remember, as we're laying this whole covenant out in these elements that we see from the ancient Near East Hittite covenants, the book of Deuteronomy is actually ordered in the same way. The outline of Deuteronomy follows almost this exact pattern. And it ends with these promises and blessings here at the tail end of the covenant. So promises and blessings, curses associated with the covenant, you bet. In chapter 28 in Deuteronomy is the primary place where you can go to see those. Now, I want to move on to the sign and then answer what's revealed in the covenant of grace with this administration. The sign for the covenant of grace, or for the covenant with Moses, is not seen in the passages we've looked at, but it's stated explicitly in Exodus chapter 31. So flip back to Exodus 31, and you'll see God explicitly state this is the sign of the covenant. We've got verse 12, chapter 31, verses 12 through 18. Now, what has happened between Exodus 20 and Exodus 31 is the extrapolation of the Ten Commandments and these various laws. And in 31, verse 12, and Yahweh said to Moses, "You are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all you shall keep my Sabbaths. For this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations." All right, he just used the word. This is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, Yahweh, sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death, life and death consequences. Whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to Yahweh. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. Therefore the people of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a covenant forever. It is a sign forever between me and the people of Israel, that in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he rested and was refreshed. And he gave to Moses, when he had finished speaking with him on Mount Sinai, the 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written with the finger of God. So what is the sign here? The sign of the covenant is the Sabbath. Now, we've seen with Adam the sign. There's not a real explicit sign, but it's thought that the tree of life was the sign of the covenant. When Adam and Eve disobeyed, they were kicked out of the garden so they might not have access to the tree of life. In this covenant with Noah, the sign was the rainbow, that God promised he'd never destroy the earth by flood again in that way. With Abraham, the sign was circumcision. And now with Moses, we see the sign is the Sabbath. Note that the Sabbath is part of the moral law in the Ten Commandments. It's the 4th command. You shall keep the Sabbath holy. Some will make the argument that because this is a sign of the Mosaic Covenant, it falls away in the New Covenant. As the New Covenant realities come, the Sabbath sign falls away so that it's not necessary for the Christian in the New Covenant to observe the Sabbath. I disagree with that. The Westminster Confession disagrees with that. Many others disagree with that. What does fall away, though, are the shadow portions of the Sabbath, right? Because we see the Old Covenant shadows falling away as the New Covenant realities are here. Now, the Sabbath, as Jesus said, man was not made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man, right? And so the Sabbath points to that eternal peace and rest that we have in God, that Christ has won for us. So, the stipulations associated with the Sabbath that are affiliated with the civil and ceremonial portions of the Sabbath, those parts fall away. But the reality of the Sabbath has broken in. As Christ broke in and brought his kingdom, the realities of the real Sabbath that the ancient Sabbath pointed forward to are becoming a reality. So you participate, as we talked about in Hebrews, you participate in the rest on Sundays more than just stopping what you do during the work week. You do that, I hope. But you participate in the spiritual reality of rest that is being fulfilled and will ultimately be realized in eternity as Christ ushers in his kingdom in all of its fullness. So while the Sabbath is a sign of the Mosaic Covenant, that doesn't mean it falls away when the New Covenant realities are on the scene. But the trappings of the civil and ceremonial aspects of the Sabbath, those fall away because the realities are now being made real. Does that make sense? We could get into a lot more in-depth discussion about that, but that's a good summary in the time that we have. And so the reality of the Sabbath, that it points to this rest and peace in Christ, that remains. And that's why in Hebrews it says, don't neglect to meet together on Sundays to worship, right? As is the habit of some. So the Sabbath is still involved. Even without looking at this idea of the Sabbath as a sign, if the Sabbath is in here, it's there. It's not going anywhere. It's part of the moral law, universal for all men for all time. So the Sabbath remains, but in a more real reality than in the Old Covenant. Now, let's answer our last question here. Any other thoughts or questions about the sign here? The sign is the Sabbath. But that doesn't mean that the sign falls away because of the New Covenant reality. Last thing that we want to note here is what's revealed about the covenant of grace in this administration. And 4 primary things that I want to emphasize. Number 1, what we see happen is a nationalizing of the people of Abraham. Right? The promise has been made to Abraham that through your family all the world will be blessed. Well, that family has now turned into a nation. And God is ordering this nation so that it functions correctly and does what it's supposed to do in order to bring about ultimately that promised seed that was promised to Adam, right back at the beginning, right? So we learn from the covenant with Abraham, okay, the seed's coming through Abraham's family. Okay, he's going to come from this nation of people. Right? So we see this nationalizing of the people coalescing around this covenant here. Number 2, and this is really important to grab, we see the inscripturation, or the writing down of, God's will. In the previous covenants, there was no writing down of God's will with Adam, with Noah, with Abraham. But now God has made it clear, here is my will for you, how you are to live and obey me and do what I command. So what this does is it makes much clearer to all of us what God's will is and how we are to worship, honor, and obey him. Whereas before it's easier to be uncertain about that, because it would have to have been passed down orally and made sure that everyone understood. But now it's written down. God writes it down in the 10 Commandments and then commands Moses to write down everything after that. What this also does is that in the writing down of God's will for us, it exposes our sin, right? That's one of the ways the law works. It acts as a mirror to show us who we really are. So we read God's will, what he commands, and say, okay, I see I'm a sinner. So it exposes our sin. The next thing that this does is because it exposes our sin, guess what? It points us to someone else to obey God's will perfectly, to fulfill his will. It's not me, I guarantee it. So it points us outside of ourselves. Where can I go to find help? Points us to ultimately to Christ, to Messiah. And then number 4, the 4th thing that it does for us is that for the believer, it aids in our sanctification. Right? For the believer, we know, okay, it pleases God that I not commit adultery and everything that flows out of that. And so I choose, out of a regenerated heart and nature, to do what is right and pleasing to God. So it aids in sanctification. So this is an important development in the Mosaic Covenant, that now God's will is written down for the people. Okay? This also helps us be humble, right? Exposes our sin, aids in our, that says humbling ability. The law has a great humbling ability. We also see, this is big number 3, the typological significance of the law. We talked about this with the book of Hebrews. All this means that there are types and shadows in the law that point us forward to a greater reality. Types and shadows in the law, like the sacrificial system, that point us forward to a greater reality. That is now developed in the Mosaic Covenant. As they look forward to that promised seed, we are learning something about what that promised seed will do and who he is through these types and shadows. All right? So that's the third thing. And underneath this, we see the beginnings of this threefold office. Primarily prophet and priest. And in seed form, king. Because in chapter 3, God says to Moses, you will be a kingdom of priests to me. And that would sound weird to combine these two offices to the Israelites. But what we see as these offices are laid out, prophets and priests, and then later on kings, we understand that the Messiah, these things typologically point us forward to the prophet, priest, king, Christ. And these things are now being unfolded out of the Mosaic Covenant, whereas they weren't unfolded in this detail before. They were mentioned in the Abrahamic Covenant. You remember kingship, priesthood, Melchizedek was in there, right? All that was seed form for this. Now Moses' covenant, boom, it expands bigger, big time. And then in the covenant with David, it's going to open up even wider until the reality of Christ comes. So we learn a lot about the covenant of grace in this administration with Moses. Now let's summarize by closing up where we started. The covenant with Moses is not a separate covenant from the covenant of grace. It is one administration of that same covenant in unity and continuity with all of the others. Right? It's not a reiteration of the covenant of works, whereas somebody must obey these laws in order to be saved. No, that's not the case. Why is there a sacrificial system instituted in the covenant if it was possible to obey other laws? Just by the fact that those two things exist alongside each other mean you're not going to do this, so I've instituted this. It's not about a covenant of works, right? But it's one administration of the overarching covenant of grace, pointing us forward to that coming seed that was promised all the way back in Adam. You've been listening to lesson number 6 in our Sunday school series on covenant theology, the Mosaic Covenant.